Hey everyone, welcome to my channel where the strange, the unexplained, and the downright creepy come to life. From real-life encounters with the paranormal to bizarre, true stories that'll keep you up at night, I bring you the eerie tales you won't hear anywhere else. If you're into late-night chills, mysterious happenings, and things that go bump in the night, you're in the right place. Subscribe, buckle up, and let's dive into the unknown. The building breathed in the darkness, its century-old bones creaking with secrets that should have stayed buried in its crumbling mortar. Every night at 3:33 a.m., the footsteps began, deliberate, measured, impossibly hollow, echoing from a floor that had been sealed and forgotten for over a decade. I should have known better than to take an apartment in the Hartwell building. The rent was too cheap for downtown, the landlord too eager to shake my hand and pocket the deposit. But after my divorce, my standards had plummeted along with my bank account, and the vintage charm of the historic district seemed like exactly the kind of fresh start I needed. The building manager, a weathered man named Kowalski, with nicotine-stained fingers and perpetually bloodshot eyes, gave me the tour with the mechanical enthusiasm of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. He mentioned the building's age, constructed in 1887, renovated in the 70s, and updated again in the 90s, though most of the original character remained intact. What he hadn't mentioned was the oppressive weight that seemed to press down from the floors above, or the way the hallway lights flickered whenever the wind picked up. My apartment on the second floor was spacious enough, with high ceilings and original hardwood floors that groaned under my feet. The windows faced east, letting in decent morning light that made the dust motes dance like tiny phantoms. I'd furnished it sparsely. A mattress on the floor, a small table, 2 chairs, and the bare minimum of kitchen supplies still stacked in boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack. The first week passed uneventfully. I settled into a routine. Work at the downtown office, dinner at the diner on 5th Street, then home to read until exhaustion overtook my restless mind. The building was quiet, populated mostly by older tenants who kept to themselves. Mrs. Chun from 2B occasionally shuffled past my door in her slippers, and I'd hear the muffled sound of her television through the thin walls. The man across the hall seemed to work nights. His door always slammed shut just as I was pouring my morning coffee. It was during the second week that the footsteps began. The first time I heard them, I was lying in bed, drifting between sleep and consciousness, when the sound cut through the silence like a blade. Steady, deliberate footsteps directly above my bedroom. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering in my chest. The red digits on my alarm clock glowed. 3:33 a.m. The footsteps continued for exactly 7 minutes. I know because I counted every second. My body rigid with tension, breathing shallow and controlled. The sound was distinct. Not the soft shuffle of slippers or the hard click of heels, but something in between. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up and sent cold rivulets of sweat down my spine. When they stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise itself. I lay awake until sunrise, muscles aching from holding myself so still, ears straining for any repetition. But the building had returned to its usual repertoire of settling creaks and distant plumbing groans. The next morning, I mentioned it to Kowalski when I ran into him replacing a burned-out bulb in the first-floor hallway. He paused, his weathered face creasing into a frown as I described what I'd heard. He explained that the third floor had been vacant for years, sealed off due to structural problems discovered during an inspection. The city had deemed it unsafe, and the owner had never bothered with the expensive repairs needed to bring it up to code. He assured me no one could possibly be living up there, suggesting I'd probably heard pipes settling, or maybe mice in the walls. But mice didn't walk with such measured, human cadence. The footsteps returned the following night. Same time, same duration, same crushing weight of dread in my chest. This time I forced myself to get up. My legs trembled as I padded barefoot to the window. I pressed my face to the cool glass and craned my neck upward, trying to see into the windows above. The third-floor windows were dark, some boarded up, others covered in grime so thick they might as well have been painted black. No light flickered behind them, no shadow passed across the glass. Yet the footsteps continued, directly overhead, slow and purposeful, as if someone were pacing back and forth across what should have been an empty room. By the fourth night, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I started drinking coffee late into the evening, afraid to sleep, afraid to lie defenseless in the dark, while those impossible footsteps marked time above me. My hands shook constantly now, and I developed a twitch in my left eye that made my reflection look like a stranger. The building superintendent had grown irritated with my repeated inquiries, insisting more firmly each time that the third floor was absolutely, unequivocally empty. When I pressed him about gaining access to check for myself, his demeanor shifted from dismissive to borderline hostile. He muttered something about insurance liability and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the lobby, questions unanswered. Sleep deprivation was taking its toll. At work, I found myself staring blankly at my computer screen for long stretches, my concentration shattered. My colleagues had started avoiding me, probably put off by my haggard appearance and the way I jumped at sudden sounds. I'd catch myself checking the time obsessively as 3:30 approached each day, my anxiety building like pressure in a sealed container. On the seventh night, something changed. The footsteps began as usual, but this time they moved in a pattern. Not the random pacing I'd grown used to, but something more deliberate. Back and forth, then a pause. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Another pause. It was almost like a code, a message tapped out in the rhythm of shoe leather against hollow floorboards. My skin crawled with the certainty that whatever was up there knew I was listening. The next morning, I made a decision that would have seemed insane 2 weeks earlier. I was going to find a way into that third floor, with or without Kowalski's permission. The building was old, and old buildings had secrets. Forgotten doors, service passages, ways for someone determined enough to access areas that were supposed to be sealed. I spent my lunch break exploring the building's exterior, circling the block to study its architecture from every angle. On the side facing the alley, I discovered a rusted fire escape that reached the third floor. Several rungs were missing, and the metal groaned ominously when I tested it, but it looked like it might support my weight. That evening, I positioned myself at my bedroom window with a pair of binoculars I'd bought at a pawn shop. At 3:33 a.m., as the footsteps began their nightly ritual, I trained the lenses on the third-floor windows. What I saw made my blood freeze. There was light up there. Not the steady glow of bulbs, but something flickering and uneven, like candlelight or flame. It moved behind the grimy windows, casting shifting shadows that danced with malevolent purpose. And in one window, the one directly above my bedroom, I saw a silhouette. Definitely human in shape, but something about the proportions was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. It stood perfectly still for several seconds, and I had the horrible sensation it was looking down at me, though I couldn't make out any features through the filthy glass. Then it began to move, and I realized, with dawning horror, that its movements matched the rhythm of the footsteps I'd been hearing. Step, step, step. Pause. Turn. Step, step, step. Pause. I dropped the binoculars, my hands shaking so violently I could barely maintain my grip. The plastic lenses hit the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. The footsteps stopped immediately. For a long moment, silence stretched between us, me, cowering by the window, and whatever was up there, frozen in its midnight dance. Then slowly, deliberately, the footsteps resumed, but now they were moving in a different direction, toward what I realized must be the stairwell. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. If it was coming down, if it could bypass the sealed entrances to the third floor, then nowhere in the building was safe. I grabbed my keys and wallet with trembling fingers, not bothering to dress beyond the t-shirt and boxers I'd been sleeping in. The hallway outside my apartment was pitch black. The overhead lights burned out weeks ago. I fumbled for the stairwell door, my bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. Behind me, I heard something else moving through the building. Not footsteps now, but a strange scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst. At the ground floor, I burst through the exit door and into the night air, gasping like a man who'd been drowning. The street was empty, lit by flickering street lamps that cast long, wavering shadows. I stood there in my underwear, shivering in the cold, staring up at the Hartwell building. The third-floor windows were dark again. No trace of the light I'd seen just minutes earlier. I spent the rest of the night in an all-night diner, nursing cup after cup of coffee, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and stress. Almost. But when I returned to the building to collect my belongings, Kowalski was waiting for me in the lobby. His face was pale, his usually steady hands trembling as he lit another cigarette. He told me other tenants had been complaining about noises during the night. Scratching sounds in the walls, footsteps in the hallways, doors opening and closing on floors that should have been empty. Mrs. Chun had found her apartment door standing wide open that morning, though she swore she'd locked it before bed. Most disturbing of all, he'd finally gone up to check the sealed third floor himself, using a master key he'd claimed didn't exist. The door had been unlocked. The heavy boards that had secured it were stacked neatly against the wall, as if they'd been carefully removed from the inside. When he shined his flashlight into the abandoned hallway, he saw footprints in the dust. Fresh footprints hovered several inches above the floor, clear impressions that never quite touched the ground. He'd sealed the door again, he said, this time with industrial adhesive and steel brackets. But we both knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was up there had found a way out before. It would find a way out again. I packed what little I owned in silence, my hands still trembling from the night before. When I carried the final box to my car, I paused and glanced up at the third-floor windows one last time. In the daylight, they looked perfectly ordinary, just smudged glass reflecting a slate-gray sky. But I knew better. When night fell and 3:33 a.m. arrived, something would pace those empty rooms again. It would wear grooves into floors that shouldn't exist, leaving floating footprints where no one had walked in a decade. I drove away without looking back. 3 months have passed. I now live in a modern ground-floor apartment. But even here, I wake at 3:33 a.m., without fail. And sometimes, in that strange moment between sleep and waking, I swear I can still hear those footsteps, measured and patient, echoing from somewhere far above, waiting for me to return. Story 2. The Mirror. Something was wrong with the mirror. That wrongness had seeped into every part of my life like water through a cracked foundation. The fluorescent lights above my barber's chair buzzed with their usual electric dirge, casting a sickly yellow glow across the black and white linoleum that had caught 40 years of stray hair and forgotten conversation. But now, when I looked into that familiar silver surface, where I'd watched myself age from 25 to 42, something looked back at me with eyes that moved a heartbeat too late. It started 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday thick with humidity, the kind that makes your shirt cling before you've even started sweating. I was preparing my station for the day's first client when I saw myself in the mirror while reaching for the disinfectant spray. My hand moved, but my reflection hesitated. Just a second, no more, before copying me. The bottle slipped from my grip and hit the marble counter with a clatter, splashing blue disinfectant in a starburst pattern. My heart skipped like I'd missed a stare. I stared at the mirror, expecting my reflection to mirror my confusion. But it was delayed, wearing a blank expression while my real face already twisted in bewilderment. I blamed exhaustion. Running a one-man barber shop meant long hours, aching muscles, gritty eyes. Everyone gets strange thoughts when they're that tired. But the seed had been planted, and seeds grow well in the dark, especially if you keep feeding them attention. By the end of the first week, the lag had grown to nearly 2 seconds. I'd scratch my beard and watch the reflection follow, just a little too late, like an actor who'd missed his cue. Customers never noticed anything strange. They weren't watching the mirror like I was. Not obsessively. Not constantly. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake in the small flat above the shop, listening to the creaks of old wood settling and the mechanical wheeze of the air conditioning unit. Sometimes, beneath that noise, I thought I heard something else. A whisper, or breathing not quite human. In the second week, I began timing it with a stopwatch. The delay was exact, for seconds. Every motion mirrored precisely, but always 4 seconds behind. When I raised my hand, my reflection followed 4 seconds later. When I turned my head, it turned too with perfect mechanical precision. But there was something worse. During those 4 seconds, my reflection sometimes moved on its own. I first noticed it while cleaning my straight razor after finishing with old Mr. Henderson. He's come in every Thursday for the same crew cut since the Eisenhower years. I wiped the blade with a towel, slow strokes from base to tip. But in the mirror, I saw my reflection holding the blade differently. Not cleaning it, but lifting it toward the light, studying the edge with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I froze, my towel pressed against the blade, and I watched as the reflection slowly, deliberately, brought the razor closer to its own throat. Not close enough to cut, just close enough for the steel to catch the fluorescent glow as it hovered near pale skin. Then, as if remembering its role, the reflection snapped back into sync, cleaning the blade just as I was. I dropped the razor. It clattered against the floor with a sound like shattering glass. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that seemed to echo too loudly in the empty shop. Mr. Henderson had left 20 minutes earlier. I was alone. Alone with the buzz of the lights and the overwhelming certainty that something was deeply, impossibly wrong. I told myself it was stress, hallucination, fatigue, logical things, but the explanations were paper-thin, useless against the cold press of something lurking behind the glass. By the third week, the delay stretched to nearly 30 seconds. Half a minute where my reflection moved through its own time, governed by rules I couldn't understand. And in those 30 seconds, it was becoming bolder, more active, more alive. I started noticing a gesture when I wasn't gesturing, mouthing words I hadn't spoken. It began making expressions that didn't match the careful neutrality I tried to maintain. Sometimes it pointed, at customers unaware in the chair, at corners where the shadows hung too thick. Sometimes it pointed directly at me with an urgency that made my chest tighten. The worst part was the expressions. My face, but twisted into emotions I couldn't name. At times it looked terrified, eyes wide, mouth parted like it was screaming a warning I couldn't hear. Other times it appeared angry, jaw clenched, brows furrowed, an alien determination wearing a face I'd lived with for 40 years. But most disturbing were the moments it looked pleading, as if begging me to understand something crucial, something that could save us both, if only I were smart enough to grasp it. My hands began shaking during cuts. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been coming to me for 15 years, mentioned I seemed nervous, asked if everything was all right at home. I told her I lived alone, had always lived alone, would probably always live alone. Who could understand this kind of madness? She left a larger tip than usual and patted my shoulder with a kind of maternal concern that closed up my throat. The mirror began to consume my thoughts. Between customers, I stood in front of it, timing the delay with obsessive precision. 35 seconds, then 38, then 40. My reflection moved like a sleepwalker, always behind, always catching up, never quite in sync with the world I inhabited. Then, one Thursday, when the air felt thick with storm, something changed. I was sweeping hair around the chair when I glanced up. My reflection was sweeping too, but in reverse. I moved left to right. It moved right to left. I bent to collect hair. It stood straight, gesturing frantically at the ceiling. My heart thudded against my ribs like a caged bird. Sweat broke across my forehead despite the air conditioning. I dropped the broom and stepped toward the mirror, breath shallow and fast. My reflection dropped its broom, too. Then it did something that froze my blood. It pressed both palms against the glass from its side and began mouthing words with frantic intensity. I heard nothing, but I could read lips well enough. Help me, then switch, then soon. The room seemed to tilt. The lights flickered in rhythm with my pulse. I pressed my palms to the glass, and for a moment, just a moment, I swear I felt warmth on the other side, like my reflection's hands were real, alive, reaching across an impossible divide. The delay had grown to nearly a full minute now, and in that minute, the thing in the mirror had become someone else entirely. Someone trapped, someone desperate, Someone who wore my face like a mask that didn't fit. And then the realization hit. What if I had it backwards? What if I wasn't watching my reflection fall behind? What if my reflection was trying to warn me? I began paying attention. Not just watching but listening to where it pointed, what it stared at when it became most agitated. It always came back to the same place. The corner behind and to the left of my barber chair. The shadows there gathered too thick, even during the brightest parts of the day. That corner had always been cold. Even in summer, customers sometimes mentioned it, asked if I had a draft. I chalked it up to poor insulation. But now I wasn't so sure. The pointing became relentless, so I moved toward it. Each step across the floorboards heavier than the last. The temperature dropped. I knelt, pressed my ear to the wall, and heard it, breathing, slow, rhythmic, like someone in deep sleep. Faint, but unmistakable. And it matched my own breathing. Exactly. But 1 minute late. Nausea surged. I wasn't looking at my reflection. I was looking at myself, trapped, somehow, in a place that ran 1 minute behind this world. And something else, something that breathed in the walls and cast no reflection, was getting ready to take my place. The switch was coming. And all this time, I had been trying to warn myself. But now, as I stared into the mirror and watched myself mouth the word now with desperate urgency, I realized that perhaps it already was. The breathing in the walls grew louder, more insistent. My reflection pressed against the glass one final time, just as the delay, suddenly and impossibly, began to shrink. 55 seconds. 50. 45. Something was coming forward through time. And I was about to discover what had been waiting in those missing seconds all along. The last thing I saw before the world shifted was my own face in the mirror. No longer delayed, no longer desperate, but wearing an expression of triumph I had never seen before. An expression I knew with absolute certainty was not my own. Story 3. There are roads that exist in more places than one. And some stretches of asphalt that bend through dimensions we weren't meant to cross. I learned this truth the hard way, mile by terrible mile. 20 years I'd been running the same route through the backwoods of Arkansas, hauling freight from Little Rock to Memphis and back again. 20 years of the same truck stops, the same faces behind cracked windshields, the same ribbon of weary asphalt stretching endlessly under my headlights. The road had become part of me, every pothole and curve memorized until I could drive it half asleep. Maybe that's why it took me so long to notice when things started changing. The 15-mile stretch between Crosset and Hamburg had always been the loneliest part of my run. Nothing but pine trees pressing close to the shoulders, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed my high beams. During the day, it was just another forgettable piece of highway. But after midnight, when the world went still and the CB radio picked up nothing but static from distant storms, that stretch felt different. Heavier. Like the darkness itself had weight. The first time I heard the whispers, I blamed interference from the El Dorado Tower. The CB crackled with what sounded like voices speaking in some foreign language. Not Spanish or French, but something older, with consonants that clicked and vowels that bent in on themselves. I fiddled with the squelch, trying to clear the signal, but the whispers only grew clearer as I drove deeper into that wooded tunnel. My hands started to sweat against the wheel. These voices weren't coming from any station. They were too close, too intimate, like someone was sitting right beside me in the cab, breathing the words directly into my ear. I reached over and killed the CB. But the whispers didn't stop. Now they seemed to seep through the metal walls of the truck. The speedometer held steady at 65, but my foot felt leaden. Every instinct screamed at me to floor it, to blast through those 15 miles as fast as the old Peterbilt could manage. Instead, I forced myself to hold steady, knuckles white on the wheel. Professional drivers don't panic. We've seen everything the road can throw at us. But I had never seen anything like what waited at mile marker 247. The bridge had been there since the 1940s, a narrow span over Bayou Macon. 2 lanes of weathered wood, groaning under the weight of 18-wheelers, with rusted railings that wouldn't stop a bicycle, let alone a fully loaded semi. I crossed it thousands of times without thinking. But tonight, As my headlights swept across those gray planks, the whispers reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache. The language, if it was a language, clawed at the inside of my skull. Words I couldn't process but that my body understood as threats. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it through my flannel. I glanced at the GPS mounted on the dash. The familiar coordinates flickered. 33.542 degrees north. 91.4718 degrees west. Became 33.21542 degrees north. 91.4719 degrees west. Then 91.94717 degrees west. The numbers danced, scrambled, like the bridge existed in multiple places at once. My breath fogged the glass. I hit the defroster with a shaking hand. But the condensation didn't clear. It formed instead spirals, impossible angles that hurt to look at. When I blinked, they vanished, leaving only the reflection of my pale, drawn face. The tires struck the wood with a hollow thunder that echoed far longer than it should. Beneath me, Bayou Macon stretched away into nothing. No moonlight, no stars, just water as black as the space between thoughts. And it reflected nothing. It seemed to swallow light itself. The whispers grew louder until they drowned out the engine noise. A chorus of voices speaking in unison about things that made my stomach churn, even though I couldn't understand a single word. Then I was across, back on solid asphalt, and the whispers cut off like someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence rang in my ears, worse than the voices had. I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see something following me. But there was only darkness and the red glow of my tail lights fading into the trees. I told myself it was just exhaustion. 20 years of midnight runs were finally catching up with me. Maybe it was time to consider day shifts, regular hours, a normal life that didn't involve staring into an endless tunnel of darkness, while strange voices whispered secrets I didn't want to know. But 3 nights later, making the same run with a load of auto parts bound for Memphis, it happened again. This time I was prepared. I had the CB turned off before I hit the tree line, and I checked the GPS coordinates for the bridge beforehand, 33° 1542 N, 91° 24/7 18W, burned into my memory. I would not let my mind play tricks on me. The whispers started anyway, seeping through the cab walls like smoke. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Voices that spoke with the authority of centuries. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. The trees pressed closer to the road, their branches scraping against the trailer with sounds like fingernails on metal. When I reached for the GPS, my hand was shaking so badly I could barely operate the touchscreen. The coordinates were wrong again, but not the same wrong as before. Now they read 33° 1542 N, 90° 14/016W, placing the bridge a full mile west of where it should be. Yet there it was, ahead of me. The same weathered planks and rusted guardrails, exactly where they'd always been. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to get through that 15-mile stretch as quickly as possible. The speedometer climbed to 70, then 75. The truck shuddered under the strain, its old engine screaming in protest. But I didn't care. I just wanted to be past that bridge, past those whispering voices that seemed to know things about me I'd never told another living soul. The wooden planks rushed beneath my tires like the keys of some massive discordant piano. The whispers rose to a shriek that seemed to come from inside my own head now, speaking words in that alien language that made my vision blur and my hands shake on the wheel. The GPS screen flickered through coordinates like a slot machine, 91° 24/7 15W, 91° 24/7 20W, 91° 24/7 12W, each reading placing the bridge in a different reality. But this time, as I reached the center of the span, something new happened. The truck lurched to the left, as if grabbed by an invisible hand. I fought the wheel, feeling the trailer start to jackknife, tires screaming against wet wood that hadn't been wet moments before. My headlights swept across the bayou below, and in that brief instant, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The water was gone. In its place stretched a vast pit filled with architectural impossibilities. Structures that climbed upward and downward simultaneously, bridges that connected to nothing, staircases that folded back on themselves. And moving through those non-Euclidean passages were shapes that my eyes refused to process, beings that existed in too many dimensions for human perception. I wrenched the wheel hard right, feeling the trailer's rear wheels leave the bridge entirely before slamming back down on solid wood. The truck straightened out just as I reached the far side, back on blessed asphalt that existed in only one reality. The whispers died away, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the engine's steady rumble. I pulled into the first truck stop I could find, a 24-hour place called Mel's that served coffee strong enough to strip paint. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the cup, and the waitress asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was just tired, which was true enough, though it didn't begin to cover what I had experienced. For 2 weeks I took different routes, I-40 to I-55, adding 3 hours to each run but avoiding that 15-mile stretch entirely. I told my dispatcher I was having truck trouble, needed to stick to major highways until I could get it properly diagnosed. He grumbled about the extra fuel costs but didn't push too hard. Professional drivers know their equipment, and if I said something was wrong, something was wrong. But the freight business runs on schedules and profit margins, and eventually I had to go back. A rush delivery to a plant in Hamburg, time-sensitive enough that the back roads were the only way to make the deadline. I found myself approaching those familiar pine trees. As the clock on my dashboard ticked past midnight, this time I was ready for war. I'd loaded up on coffee and energy drinks, cranked the radio loud enough to drown out whispers, and programmed 3 different GPS units with the bridge's coordinates. If reality wanted to shift around me, it would have to work harder than before. The whispers started right on schedule, but I was expecting them now. I gripped the wheel with both hands and kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look at the GPS screens or the mirrors or anything else that might show me things I didn't want to see. Professional drivers focus on what matters: the road, the load, the destination. Everything else is just distraction. But this time, the whispers were different. I heard words I recognized, though they still sent ice water through my veins. They spoke my name over and over, in voices that sounded like everyone I'd ever known. My ex-wife calling me the same names she used during our divorce. My father expressing the disappointment he took to his grave. Coworkers who smiled to my face while spreading rumors behind my back. My foot trembled on the accelerator. The speedometer wavered between 60 and 70 as my concentration broke beneath the assault of familiar voices speaking harsh truths. The trees leaned inward, blocking out what little starlight filtered through the canopy, until I was driving through a tunnel of absolute darkness, lit only by my headlights. The GPS screens were going haywire now, 3 of them, each showing different coordinates that changed by the second. One placed me in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, another in the Arctic Circle. The third displayed numbers that didn't correspond to any location on Earth, coordinates that belonged only in mathematical abstractions. When the bridge appeared in my headlights, it looked different. The wooden planks had been replaced by metal grating that gleamed like scales. The guardrails had grown into twisted shapes, more like the bars of a cage than safety barriers. The whispers rose to a roar, and it came from the bridge itself, as if the structure were alive and screaming. I hit the brakes without thinking. The truck's momentum carried it forward, onto that impossible span. The metal grating rang like church bells under my tires, each note perfectly pitched to resonate in my bones. The whispers were inside my head now, not heard but felt. Vibrations that turned my thoughts into chaos. And then I understood. The bridge wasn't just crossing the bayou, it was crossing between worlds, between realities, between dimensions that overlapped in ways no human mind was meant to comprehend. Every time I'd driven across it, I'd been traveling not just through space, but through the thin places where one reality bled into another. The GPS coordinates weren't wrong. They were all correct, simultaneously, each marking the bridge's position in dozens of versions of the same world. In some, the bayou ran a mile to the east. In others, it had dried up centuries ago. Still others where it had never existed at all. And in every one of them, Something was waiting, watching, whispering secrets mortals weren't meant to know. I reached the center of the span and stopped. Just stopped. Right there, in the middle of that impossible structure that existed in too many places at once. The engine idled. My hands froze on the wheel. I stared into the abyss that had replaced Bayou Macon. The shapes moving through those non-Euclidean depths were clearer now, beings of angles and curves that hurt to perceive. They climbed toward me through structures that folded space like origami, and I realized they weren't malevolent. They were curious. They'd been watching travelers cross their bridge for decades, maybe centuries, trying to understand creatures that existed in only 3 dimensions. The whispers weren't threats. They were attempts at communication. These entities thought in languages of geometry and physics, trying to speak to a mind that could only process linear time and Euclidean space. They wanted to share their knowledge, to show me the true nature of reality. But human consciousness wasn't made to hold such revelations without shattering. I understood now why the GPS coordinates changed. The bridge was a nexus point, a place where realities overlapped and intersected. Each time I crossed it, I entered a slightly different version of the world. Most of the time, the differences were too small to notice. But sometimes, I put the truck back in gear and rolled forward, crossing the rest of the bridge at a steady 25 miles per hour. The whispers followed me, but they felt different now. Less threatening, more like a benediction from beings that existed beyond normal space and time. When I reached solid asphalt on the far side, they faded away, with what almost sounded like disappointment. I've been running that route for 3 years since that night. The whispers still come when I cross the bridge after midnight. But now I listen to them without fear, letting their alien words wash over me like a strange kind of music. Sometimes I think I'm beginning to understand. Just fragments. Truths about the nature of reality that would sound like madness to anyone else. The GPS still shows different coordinates each time I cross, each one marking the bridge's position in a parallel world. I've learned to read the patterns, to recognize which coordinates lead to which version of reality. Most of the time, I stick to the one I know, the one where my ex-wife still lives in Little Rock, and my regular truck stops serve coffee that tastes like burnt motor oil. But sometimes, late at night, when the loneliness gets too heavy and the road stretches endlessly ahead, I let the bridge carry me somewhere else. Somewhere the whispers are a little clearer. Somewhere the darkness holds secrets worth knowing. Somewhere the 15-mile stretch between Crowett and Hamburg leads to destinations that don't exist on any earthly map. The road goes on forever, in more directions than most people ever realize. And sometimes, if you're brave enough or foolish enough to listen, the whispers will show you just how far it really goes. The fluorescent lights in the elevator shaft flickered with the dying gasps of old ballasts, casting erratic shadows that danced like restless spirits across the concrete walls. Each sputter sent a chill down my spine, a cold that had nothing to do with the building's perpetual dampness. My name is Marcus Webb. I've been fixing elevators for 15 years. I'm 38, and by now, I've seen every kind of mechanical failure, every safety violation, every corner-cutting mistake building owners think they can get away with. But standing in that shaft at 2:47 a.m., surrounded by the oppressive silence of the Meridian building, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The emergency call came just after midnight. Elevator stuck between floors, occupants trapped. Routine, I thought. Standard night shift chaos. When I arrived, the building loomed like a monolith against a starless sky. 12 stories of blackened windows staring down at me like blind eyes. The security guard seemed nervous, eyes constantly darting over his shoulder. He muttered in hushed tones about how the elevator had been acting up for weeks. By the time I got there, the fire department had already evacuated the occupants through the emergency hatch. The car was empty. I was alone. The elevator hung still between the 9th and 10th floors. Cables were taut. No slippage. No visible damage. Everything looked normal. Until I opened the control panel. That's when my blood turned to ice. Amid the usual tangle of wires, switches, and indicator lights, there was a button that didn't belong. Small, unmarked, nestled between the ground floor and basement indicators. Its surface was unnaturally smooth, almost organic, and instead of reflecting light, it seemed to drink it in. The building's blueprints showed only one basement, used for storage and mechanical equipment. But the system told a different story. The elevator's diagnostics registered 13 stops, not 12. The logs showed the car had been visiting this phantom floor regularly, sometimes multiple times a night, always during off hours, always when the building was supposed to be empty. My hands began to shake. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill. Every instinct screamed, leave, report it in the morning, let someone else poke the beehive. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, sank its claws into me, and I pressed the button. The elevator groaned, shuddering as if it were resisting the command. The floor indicator blinked, scrambled, then settled on B2. The characters looked wrong, skewed, faintly glowing. Staring too long made my eyes water. When the doors finally slid open with a pneumatic sigh, I stepped out, and into a nightmare wearing the mask of normalcy. The hallway looked identical to the rest of the building. Same beige carpeting, same buzzing fluorescence, same numbered office doors. But the air was stale, metallic, tinged with a sweetness like wilted flowers left too long in stagnant water. Then I heard the sound, phones ringing. Not one or two dozens. Their shrill cries echoed from behind every door, bouncing off the walls, layering into a cacophony of desperate, unanswered calls. Beneath it, another sound, the steady clack-clack-clack of typewriter keys. I froze. Typewriters. In 2024, I crept toward the nearest office, room 2011, and peered through the frosted glass. Inside was a perfectly preserved 1970s workspace. Wood-paneled walls, orange shag carpeting, dusty Venetian blinds. And at its center, an IBM Selectric typewriter, clacking away all on its own. No hands on the keys. No person in the room. Line after line of text appeared on yellowed paper, typed by invisible fingers. The rotary phone on the desk rang without pause. As I watched, numb with dread, the typewriter reached the end of a sentence and dinged, executing a perfect carriage return, the sound echoing through the glass like a death knell. I tried the door handle. Locked. The next office was the same. And the next. And the next. Something was down there with me. Something that had been waiting beneath 12 floors of silence, behind a button that should never have existed. Behind each frosted glass door, I glimpsed echoes of another time. Desks from the Carter administration sat untouched. Rotary phones rang out in shrill, unanswered bursts. Typewriters, those damn typewriters, clacked away at some invisible correspondence, hammering letters into yellowing paper like hammers tapping on coffins. I couldn't read what they were typing, not clearly, but in the jittery motion of the carriage returns, I caught repeated phrases, the same lines over and over again, meaningless loops of ghostly dictation. My breathing turned shallow, rapid. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with a skull-penetrating hum, each flicker syncing with the pulse in my temples. Every step I took down that hallway felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself had thickened, congealed into something with weight, something that wanted to hold me in place. Then I began to notice details, small at first but unmistakable. The water fountain on the wall bore a manufacture date, 1974. The fire extinguisher cases were cased in curved chrome and beveled glass, the kind I hadn't seen since visiting my father's office as a child. The exit signs glowed faintly, not with LED, but with the soft radioactive luminescence of radium paint, banned decades ago for the cancer it left in its wake. But it was the bulletin board beside the elevator that froze me in place. Beneath a warped sheet of yellowed plastic, barely visible through decades of grime, was a newspaper clipping. Its headline, in thick block type, read, "Meridian Building Opens. City's newest commercial complex promises modern convenience." The date was September 15th, 1974. 50 years ago. My hands trembled as I read the article. Everything matched, the address, the architect's name, even the same bland promises of cutting-edge amenities. But that couldn't be. The Meridian building was constructed in 1998. I'd seen the permits, the inspection reports, the occupancy certificates myself. I'd filed some of them. There was no mistake. And then, the typewriter stopped. Every single one. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding like a drum in my ears. The phone still rang, shrill and relentless, but the absence of the typing created a void, an emptiness that made the air feel thinner, like the pressure had suddenly dropped. Then, one by one, the phones began to go silent. Office 2011 stopped ringing. Then 203, 205, 207. The sound was moving, progressing down the hall. Toward me. I backed away, step by step, toward the elevator. My feet made no sound on the shag carpet, but it felt as though every movement announced me louder than any scream. The last phone to stop ringing was right beside me. Office 225. Then, in the dead silence that followed, I heard it. Footsteps. Not from one office, but all of them. Dozens of synchronized footfalls, the slow drag of leather soles on thick carpeting. They were standing, rising from their desks, every single one of them, and they were moving toward their doors. I slammed my hand against the elevator button, again and again, my finger trembling with panic. The mechanical groan of the elevator winding to life was slower than I remembered. Lethargic, deliberate, as though it were in no hurry to save me. Behind me, the office doors began to rattle. First one, then another, then all of them. A percussion of locked doorknobs shaking, pounding, as if trying to keep something in. Or worse, trying to let something out. The elevator doors opened just in time. I dove inside, breath ragged, stabbing at the ground button until my thumb hurt. As the car began to ascend, I looked back one last time. Every office door was open. Each room bathed the hallway in amber light, but the offices themselves were empty. Chairs pulled away from desks, still warm with the memory of presence. The typewriters had begun again, their cadence somehow more frantic, more purposeful. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I didn't stop. I ran, left my tools, my paperwork, everything behind, drove through empty streets with white-knuckled hands clamped to the wheel, checking the rearview mirror every block for a tale that never appeared. At home, I scoured the city's public records. Every official document confirmed the 1998 construction date. Permits, blueprints, zoning approvals, all stamped and certified. There was nothing from 1974. No proof the building had existed prior to that year. But then I found something. Buried in a digitized archive of the city's defunct evening paper, hidden in the microfilm reels few had touched in decades, was a tiny, forgotten item dated October 31st, 1974. The headline read, "Meridian Building Fire Claims Unknown Number. Basement Levels Sealed Pending Investigation." The article was brief. An electrical fire had broken out in the lower levels of the building during the night shift. Several workers were unaccounted for. The basement was deemed structurally unsafe and sealed indefinitely. The investigation was ongoing. No further reports followed. The building was demolished. A new structure rose in its place 24 years later. But somehow, that floor remained. Pocket of time sealed off from history. A sliver of October 31st, 1974, eternally repeating beneath polished marble and glass. Where phones never stop ringing. Where typewriters never stop typing. And where the night shift never got to go home. Phones ring eternally for conversations that will never be answered, and reports are typed that will never be read. I quit my job the next morning. I told my supervisor I was switching careers, cited burnout, family obligations. I never mentioned the Meridian building or what I'd found in its impossible depths. But sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, when sleep refuses to come, I wonder about those phantom workers, trapped in their eternal routine. I wonder if they know they're dead, or if they believe they're just working late, waiting for morning to release them from their fluorescent-lit purgatory. And I wonder, with a terror that makes my skin crawl and my breath catch, if pressing that unmarked button was the first step in joining them. The worst part isn't the wondering, though. It's the dreams. Every night since that encounter, I dream of typing. I sit at a desk I don't recognize, in an office that smells of old coffee and forgotten ambitions. My fingers move across the keys with mechanical precision. I type the same report over and over, words that make no sense, but feel desperately important. The phone beside me rings constantly, but I never answer. I can't answer, because my shift isn't over yet, and it never will be. The only mercy is that I wake each morning in my own bed, in my own time. But as the dreams grow more vivid, and the memory of that basement floor sharpens instead of fading, I've begun to wonder, is waking up really an escape, or just a brief intermission between shifts in a job I never applied for, but can never quit? Sometimes I find myself driving past the Meridian building, and I swear, I see a faint glow emanating from somewhere deep below ground, pulsing in rhythm with the typing that echoes in my dreams. I haven't pressed that button again, yet. Story 5, beginning. Title: Room 13. The fluorescent lights above the front desk hummed their sickly tune, casting everything in that pale, institutional glow that makes even healthy skin look corpse-like. It was 2:47 a.m. on another sleepless night at the roadside rest stop, and the only sounds were the distant rumble of 18-wheelers on the highway and the persistent buzz of dying electricity. That's when I first noticed the discrepancy that would unravel my grip on reality. My name is Marcus. I've been working the night shift at this forgotten strip of asphalt and broken dreams for 3 years now. I'm 29 years old. No college degree. No prospects. Just a guy who found his niche in the hours when most people sleep, and decent folks avoid places like this. The roadside rest sits on Highway 50, somewhere between nowhere and nothing, catering to truckers, traveling salesmen, and the occasional family desperate enough to ignore our one-star reviews. The computer system showed room 13 as occupied. A red block on the screen indicated someone had checked in. But according to every physical record I could find, the registration book, the key log, even the cleaning schedule, the room had been empty for 6 days. I stared at the monitor, my tired eyes trying to make sense of the contradiction. The timestamp showed the room had been marked as occupied at 11:43 p.m., roughly 3 hours into my shift. I hadn't checked anyone in. My heart began its first irregular rhythm of the night. A subtle acceleration, I told myself, was just caffeine. Just exhaustion. I grabbed the master keys and decided to investigate. The walk from the front desk to room 13 felt longer than usual, my footsteps echoing off concrete that seemed to absorb sound instead of reflecting it. The motel was built in the standard L shape, with room 13 positioned at the far end of the longer wing, isolated from the other occupied rooms. The door looked normal enough. Same faded green paint, same tarnished brass numbers as every other room. But something felt off. The air around it was heavier, as if resisting movement. I pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. Absolute silence. Not even the low hum of the air conditioning unit that should have been running. Following protocol, I knocked softly and announced myself as hotel staff. No response. I used the master key and stepped inside. The room was empty. The bed was made, the carpet vacuumed, the bathroom spotless. Everything exactly as it should be in an unoccupied room. And yet, the computer still showed it as occupied. Now that I was inside, I noticed a smell. Not cleaning products or the musty scent typical of cheap motels. Something organic, slightly sweet. Like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Back at the desk, I checked the system again. Still marked as occupied. I manually switched the status to vacant, watching the red block on the screen turn green. Problem solved, I thought. A computer glitch. It happened often enough in a place where the technology was older than some of the carpet stains. But at 3:15 a.m., the room showed as occupied again. This time, I didn't go check right away. Instead, I pulled up the security feeds on the second monitor. The roadside motel had 4 exterior cameras. One for the parking lot, one on each end of the building, and one facing the front desk. Room 13 was within the range of the East Wing camera. I rewound the footage to 11:43 p.m., the moment the system first marked the room as occupied. The image quality was poor, all grainy black and white. Shadows looked solid. Solid things wavered. First, nothing. Just the empty concrete lot and the occasional semi passing on the highway, headlights sweeping briefly across the camera's view. Then, at 11:42 p.m., I saw her. A figure approached room 13. The timestamp matched exactly when the system registered the room as occupied. But there was something wrong with the image. She appeared translucent, like smoke or mist shaped into a woman. She held 2 suitcases, one in each hand, and moved with purpose toward the door. She reached for the doorknob. I couldn't see if she used a key, but the door opened. She stepped inside. 1 minute later, the computer registered the room as occupied. My mouth went dry. I replayed the footage 3 times. Each viewing confirmed what I'd seen and made it harder to believe. She was definitely there, definitely moving with intention, but wrong somehow. Too smooth, too fluid. Her motions lacked the tiny imperfections that made human movement real. I fast-forwarded to 6 a.m., when the day shift arrived and the room mysteriously switched to vacant. At 5:58 a.m., the same figure exited room 13, still holding her 2 suitcases. She walked toward the camera, growing larger in the frame. For a brief moment, I could make out her features. Middle-aged, wearing a business suit, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Then she passed out of frame and vanished. She returned the next night at exactly 11:43 p.m. By the 4th night, I had identified a pattern. By now I'd started thinking of her simply as the guest, arrived each night at the same time, stayed until just before 6 a.m., and somehow triggered the system to log her presence. I began keeping detailed notes. That's when I noticed she was changing. On the first night, she had been barely visible, a suggestion more than a figure. By the 4th night, she appeared more solid, more defined. Even the grainy security footage couldn't conceal the fact that she was becoming increasingly opaque. Her movements too had changed. No longer gliding to the door, she now walked with a recognizably human gait. My sleep became fragmented and useless. I would lie in bed during the day, staring at the ceiling, replaying the footage over and over in my mind. The rational part of me insisted there had to be an explanation, camera error, software glitch, maybe even a prank. But the visceral part, the part that made my heart race and soaked my shirt with cold sweat, knew I was seeing something impossible. I thought about telling my supervisor, Bob. But how do you explain to a man whose idea of excitement is Wednesday's early bird special at Denny's that you're being visited nightly by a ghost who seems to be learning how to become human? I imagined the conversation and decided to keep investigating on my own. On the 7th night, I stationed myself in the parking lot, camera and flashlight in hand, positioned where I could see room 13 with my own eyes instead of relying on grainy footage. The October air was sharp against my skin. Every noise, the rustle of dry leaves, the hum of distant traffic, the building settling, felt loud and ominous. At exactly 11:43 p.m., she appeared. This time I saw her clearly, not through a monitor but with my own eyes. She was more solid than ever, though not entirely opaque. I could still faintly see the wall through her. Her suit was dark blue. Her hair, auburn, was tightly pulled back. Her face bore the tense expression of someone perpetually running late for an important meeting. She walked directly to room 13. From a purse I hadn't noticed before, she produced what looked like a key. An actual physical key, not one of the electronic cards we used. She inserted it into the lock, turned it with practiced ease, and disappeared inside. The door shut behind her with a sound that cut through the stillness like a crack of thunder. It echoed unnaturally across the parking lot. I stayed in my car until dawn, watching, waiting for her to come out. But by 5:58 a.m., she was simply gone. One moment, the computer marked the room as occupied. The next, it showed vacant. I never saw her leave. By the 10th night, I was a wreck. My hands shook constantly. I'd lost 12 pounds, surviving on stale vending machine sandwiches and bad coffee. Sleep came in broken fragments, shattered by dreams of translucent figures lugging suitcases down endless motel corridors. All identical, all devoid of exits. And the guest, she was changing. She no longer flickered on the screen or hovered at the edge of perception. She cast a shadow now. I watched her approach room 13 on the security camera. Her gait steady, human, natural. Almost. But something still wasn't right. She hadn't come from any visible direction. One moment the camera feed was empty, the next she was there, appearing at the very edge of the frame like she had stepped out of the pixels themselves. That night was different. She paused at the door, then slowly, deliberately, turned toward the camera. Toward me. She couldn't possibly know I was watching. And yet, her face filled the grainy feed, and her eyes locked onto mine through the screen. Dark eyes. Intelligent. Aware. There was nothing vague or spectral about them. They were the eyes of something ancient wearing a human face. I recoiled instinctively, my chair skidding backwards across the floor. When I looked again, she was gone. The door to room 13 had closed behind her. The system marked the room as occupied. For the first time since this had started, I picked up the phone and called the room. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, someone answered. Hello. A woman's voice. Calm, professional. Slightly impatient. I hung up, my hands trembling so badly I could barely replace the receiver. She had answered. The translucent woman with the luggage had answered the phone in room 13. The next 3 nights blurred into a waking nightmare. I barely slept, filling notebooks with feverish scribbles. Times, dates, observations. She was growing more solid with each passing night. More human, more present. By the 13th night, and yes, I had been counting obsessively, I knew something was coming. And so did she. That night, she no longer looked like a ghost or even a glitch in the system. She looked like a business traveler. Pressed slacks, sensible shoes, hair pulled back. She could have been anyone. Someone you'd pass in an airport or nod at in a hotel lobby. But I knew better. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. At exactly 2:30 a.m., on the 13th night, she stepped out of room 13 and began walking toward the front desk. I heard her footsteps on the concrete, measured, deliberate. The front door opened with a mechanical chime. She walked in. I couldn't move. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echoing in my skull. She approached the counter. Calm, unhurried, certain. And now I saw her up close. No grainy monitor, no pixelated distortion. She looked the same, and yet, not. Her skin had a waxy sheen, like it was coated in too much foundation. Her eyes moved normally, tracking, focusing, but they held no light, no soul, just focus. The bids came in, $25, $30, $45, and with each, a strange electric charge ran through me. Finally, the gavel fell and the camera was mine. The drive home was a blur of unease. Every red light felt endless, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced someone was following me, even though the road behind was empty. The camera rested in its worn leather case on the passenger seat, and I swear I could feel it watching me through the closed bag. That evening, I loaded a roll of black and white Trix 400 film, my trusted stock for decades, and set out to test the camera. For 2 hours, I wandered the neighborhood, capturing familiar scenes. The old oak tree on the corner of 5th and Main, the abandoned gas station with its rusted pumps, the small park where joggers traced their usual paths. The camera felt perfectly balanced in my hands, its mechanical precision a joy to wield. Each shutter click was crisp and definitive, and I slipped into the comforting rhythm of framing and exposure. By the time I returned home, I had convinced myself that my earlier unease was just nerves about the new equipment. My basement darkroom, bathed in the warm red light and smelling of chemicals, was my sanctuary for 20 years. Usually calming, but tonight the strange electricity returned, making my hands tremble as I removed the film canister from the camera. At first, developing went normally. I watched images appear on the film, the oak tree, the gas station, the park. But as the pictures sharpened, my breath quickened. Figures appeared in the photos, people who had not been there when I took them. Under the oak tree stood a woman in a long coat, her face turned directly toward the camera, mouth open in a silent scream. She held a small cardboard sign, but the text was too tiny to read on the negative. My heart pounded as I examined the other frames. At the gas station, a man in coveralls stood beside the pumps, his eyes wide with terror, also holding a sign. In the park photo, 3 figures, An elderly man, a young woman, and an androgynous person stood motionless among the joggers, all facing the camera with desperate expressions. I had to sit down. The darkroom suddenly felt suffocating, the red light oppressive rather than comforting. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I tried to rationalize. Double exposure? Impossible. The figure's shadows fell naturally. Their placement was perfect. Film defect. The images were too sharp and detailed. With trembling hands, I made contact prints. Under the enlarger's harsh light, the signs became clearer. Dates and coordinates were written in a shaky hand, full of urgency and fear. The woman's sign read, May 29, 2025, 47 degree 120.28, N, 74 degree 060 W. Today's date and Manhattan coordinates. The man at the gas station held a sign with tomorrow's date and coordinates I recognized as somewhere in New Jersey. The three figures in the park each held different dates, all within the next week, all with specific geographic locations. I stumbled upstairs, legs weak beneath me. The house felt different, too quiet, too empty. Every creak of settling would made me jump. I checked all the locks repeatedly. The camera sat innocently on my kitchen table, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was watching me. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pleading faces, mouths open in silent screams. I kept getting up to check on the camera, half expecting it to move on its own, but it remained exactly where I left it. The next day, I tried to focus on a wedding shoot, but my mind kept drifting back to the coordinates. The Manhattan location gnawed at me most. During lunch, I looked it up online. It was the address of a building that had collapsed 2 days ago, a construction accident. No fatalities. According to the news reports, several people had been hospitalized. I stared at the screen for a long time, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The date on the woman's sign had been yesterday, 1 day after the accident occurred. That evening, despite every rational part of my mind screaming against it, I loaded another roll of film into the Leica. I told myself I needed to understand what was happening, that there had to be a logical explanation. But as I walked through the streets, camera in hand, my body knew better. My heart rate never dropped below a racing pace, and cold sweat made my shirt cling uncomfortably to my back. I photographed different locations this time: the library, the coffee shop on Elm Street, the old cemetery at the edge of town. Each click of the shutter sent a small shock through my fingers, and I began to notice that the world looked slightly different through the viewfinder. Colors seemed muted, shadows appeared deeper, and there was always movement at the edge of my vision that disappeared whenever I looked directly at it. Back in the darkroom, my hands shook so badly I could barely load the film onto the developing reel. The chemical smells that had once been comforting now made me nauseous, and the red light felt like being trapped inside a beating heart. The new photographs were worse. Many more figures this time, scattered throughout each image like a crowd of the desperate. They all faced the camera directly, all held signs with dates and coordinates, and all wore expressions of such raw terror that looking at them made my chest tighten with sympathetic panic. But it was the dates that truly chilled me. They progressed chronologically, starting with tomorrow and extending through the next month. The coordinates covered locations across the country. Some I recognized, others I didn't. I wrote them all down with a shaking hand, my neat photographer's penmanship deteriorating into barely legible scrolls. Over the following days, I began checking news reports obsessively, cross-referencing them with the coordinates and dates from the photographs. The pattern became undeniable. A bridge collapse in Oregon matched coordinates from one of the signs, occurring exactly on the predicted date. A gas explosion in Texas. A sinkhole in Florida. Each disaster corresponded precisely to the information held by the figures in my photographs. The camera had somehow captured people who would be affected by future events. Not casualties, but witnesses, survivors. People whose lives would be forever changed by things that hadn't yet happened. They were reaching through time, trying to warn someone, anyone, of what was coming. But the most disturbing realization came when I started looking more closely at the figures themselves. Some of them looked familiar. The elderly man from the park, I was certain I had seen him somewhere before. The young woman. Her face nagged at me with the persistence of a half-remembered dream. It was while flipping through old photo albums that I found them. The elderly man was Mr. Henderson, who had run the corner store until it closed 3 years ago. The young woman was Sarah Chun, a local artist whose work I had photographed for a gallery opening. Both had been dead for over a year. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow, driving me to my knees in the middle of my living room. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. The figures in the photographs weren't trying to warn about future disasters. They were showing me where they had been trapped, caught between moments between one reality and another. The camera wasn't just capturing images. It was capturing souls. That night, I made a decision that terrified me almost as much as the photographs themselves. I loaded one final roll of film, but this time, I pointed the camera at myself. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the Leica steady, I took a self-portrait. The flash seemed brighter than it should have been, and for just a moment, I thought I saw other faces reflected in the mirror behind me. All the people from the previous photographs, watching with those same pleading expressions. Developing this final image took every ounce of courage I possessed. As the photograph emerged in the developer, I saw myself staring back from the paper. But I wasn't alone. Standing behind me, translucent but clearly visible, were dozens of figures. They filled the frame, stretching back into impossible depths, all holding signs, all facing the camera with expressions of desperate hope. And in my own hands, reflected in the mirror, I held a sign of my own. The date was 6 months in the future. The coordinates were my exact location, my house, my darkroom, the place where I stood at that very moment. I understood then that the camera had chosen me, just as it had chosen all the others. We were all trapped in the space between moments, between what was and what would be, forced to watch as time unfolded around us while we remained frozen in our singular instances of terror and realization. The camera sits on my desk now as I write this. I've tried to destroy it, smashing it with a hammer, burning it, even burying it in the woods behind my house. But it always returns, sitting exactly where it was before, unmarked and patient, waiting for the next roll of film, waiting for the next moment to capture and hold forever. I don't take photographs anymore. Can't risk adding anyone else to that collection of trapped souls. But sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch glimpses of other photographers, other cameras, other moments of realization. The network is growing, spreading one captured instant at a time. The date on my sign approaches with each passing day, and I find myself checking the calendar obsessively, counting down to my own moment of permanence. When it comes, I know I'll be ready. I'll be holding my own sign, warning whoever comes after me, adding my voice to the chorus of the trapped and the desperate. But until then, I wait and I watch. And I remember that not all photographs capture moments in time. Some create them, freeze them, and hold them forever in the space between the click of the shutter and the fall of light onto film. The camera sees all. The camera keeps all. And once it has seen you, you can never truly leave. Story 7. The dead don't rest, they rearrange. The first thing you notice about working night security at Willowbrook Cemetery isn't the silence. It's how the silence moves. It shifts between the headstones like something alive, pooling in the older sections where the marble has blackened with age, then spilling over into the newer plots where the granite still gleams under the pale streetlights. After 3 months on this job, I thought I'd gotten used to it. I was wrong. My name is Marcus Reed, and I'm 52 years old. I've worked security for most of my adult life. Shopping malls, office buildings, construction sites, places where the worst thing you might encounter is a drunk teenager or a vagrant looking for shelter. But when the company offered me this position at Willowbrook, I took it without hesitation. Better pay, fewer people to deal with, and how much trouble could dead folks cause? The cemetery spans 47 acres of rolling hills just outside the city limits. Established in 1847, it holds the remains of Civil War soldiers, prominent local families, and thousands of ordinary people who lived and died in this corner of Pennsylvania. The older sections spread across the western hills, where stones lean at odd angles and moss covers names that time has tried to erase. The newer sections occupy the eastern slopes, organized in neat rows that make my nightly rounds more efficient. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 8 hours of walking predetermined routes, checking gates, and ensuring nobody disturbs the peace. The routine became second nature quickly. Start at the main entrance, work clockwise through sections A through M, then counterclockwise back to the office. 2 complete circuits per night with hourly radio check-ins to the monitoring service. It was during my 4th week that I first noticed something off. I was completing my second round, maybe 2:30 in the morning, when I passed through section G, one of the older areas where the headstones date back to the 1890s. I'd walked this same path hundreds of times already, knew every crack in the pavement, every tree that cast shadows across the narrow cemetery roads. But something felt different. Not wrong exactly, just shifted. I stopped walking and swept my flashlight beam across the familiar landscape. The yellow circle of light passed over rows of granite and marble monuments, some topped with angels or crosses, others simple slabs marking where people had chosen to rest forever. Everything looked normal, yet the feeling persisted, like walking into a room and sensing someone had moved the furniture while you were away. My heart rate picked up slightly, that low-level alert that comes from years of security work. I spent an extra 10 minutes in that section, checking between headstones, looking for signs of vandalism or disturbance. Finding nothing unusual, I continued my route, but the uneasiness lingered like smoke in my lungs. 3 nights later, the feeling returned in the same spot. This time I was certain something had changed. I pulled out my phone and took several photographs of the area, though I couldn't have explained why if anyone had asked. The pictures showed nothing but weathered stone markers arranged in their eternal rows, but I saved them anyway. Over the following weeks, the sensation of wrongness grew stronger. It wasn't limited to section G anymore. I began feeling it in other older areas, particularly in sections D, H, and K. My chest tightened whenever I approached, and my breathing grew shallow and rapid. I began timing my rounds more carefully, noting exactly when and where these episodes occurred. The breakthrough came during my 7th week on the job. While reviewing photographs I'd taken, comparing images of the same areas on different nights, I noticed something unsettling. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell's headstone, a modest gray granite marker from 1923, had definitely moved. Not fallen or tilted, but shifted about 3 inches to the northeast from where it had been just 5 days earlier. My hands shook as I scrolled through more photos, cross-referencing locations and dates. Thomas McKenna's elaborate Victorian monument had shifted 4 inches southwest. Sarah Chen's simple stone had crept 2 inches due north. The movements were subtle, easily dismissed as tricks of perception or camera angles, but once I started looking, the pattern became undeniable. Over the next several nights, I focused on documentation rather than routine patrols. Armed with measuring tape, notebook, and camera, I began mapping every headstone in the affected sections. The work was methodical and exhausting, crawling between graves, measuring distances to fixed reference points, recording precise coordinates. The results made my mouth dry and my palms slick with cold sweat. Over 2 weeks, 37 headstones had moved, not random shifts from settling ground or frost heave, but deliberate repositioning. When I plotted their new locations on paper and connected the stones with pencil lines based on their movements, shapes emerged. Angular symbols, almost like letters from an alphabet I didn't recognize. Sleep became elusive. On days off, I researched cemetery maintenance, geological surveys, anything that might explain what I was witnessing. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that natural causes couldn't account for the precision of these movements. I began taking measurements multiple times each shift, checking stones at the beginning and end of my rounds. The shifts were always small, never more than 6 inches in a single night, but consistent and always in the same directions relative to the emerging patterns. My supervisor noticed my increased attention during one surprise visit. He commented that I seemed more thorough than previous guards, spending extra time in rarely visited areas. I told him I'd noticed some settling issues that might need grounds crew attention, which seemed to satisfy his curiosity. Privately, I was becoming obsessed. I printed maps of the cemetery, covering them with measurements, drawings, and photographs. My kitchen table disappeared beneath layers of documentation I pored over during daylight hours when I should have been sleeping. The symbols became clearer as more stones moved into position. During my 10th week, I made a discovery that sent ice through my veins. While researching the symbols online, I found references in academic papers on comparative religion and occult archaeology. The shapes matched illustrations from medieval grimoires, ancient texts on supernatural practices and dimensional theory. One symbol, formed by 7 headstones in Section D, corresponded exactly to a diagram labeled a threshold marker in a digitized manuscript from a Romanian monastery. The accompanying Latin text described it as a focal point for passages between realms of existence. My hands trembled violently as I read. I had to put down my phone. The cemetery suddenly felt different during my next shift. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more significant. The silence that once felt empty now felt pregnant with possibilities I didn't want to consider. I began carrying a small digital recorder during rounds, documenting not just visual changes, but any unusual sounds or sensations. Reviewing the audio later, I discovered a low-frequency humming I hadn't consciously noticed while walking. The sound was strongest near the areas where the symbols were forming. The other symbols were forming faster now. In Section K, 6 headstones arranged themselves into what my research suggested was called a viewing aperture, supposedly allowing observation across dimensional boundaries. Section H was developing what appeared to be a summoning focus, though the text didn't specify what was summoned. My appetite vanished. Food tasted like cardboard, and my stomach remained knotted with constant tension. I lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks. My reflection in the security office mirror stared back at me. Hollow cheeks, dark circles framing eyes that seemed to belong more to the cemetery's permanent residents than to the living. By week 12, the symbols were complete. 7 distinct formations, each made up of headstones that had shifted with impossible precision, now arranged into perfect geometric patterns scattered across the older sections. Standing in the heart of the cemetery during my midnight patrols, I could see them all. Ancient signs not carved in stone, but created by the stones themselves. Then the dreams began. Though dreams feels like the wrong word, since these visions came to me wide awake as I walked my rounds. I saw the cemetery from impossible angles, aerial views, glimpses beneath the earth, scenes from decades, even centuries ago. Faces in old-fashioned clothing appeared, always turned away from me. Once, I watched the cemetery's construction in 1847. Workers placed the first headstones carefully, guided by a man in a long black coat consulting a worn leather-bound book. The layout wasn't random. It was part of a design, one only visible after enough graves had been filled. Enough time had passed for the stones to slowly migrate into place. The weight of this revelation hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with nausea. Willowbrook Cemetery wasn't just a resting place. It was a machine, a slow-moving device designed to open doorways, powered by the gradual shifting of markers over decades, even centuries. And now, after nearly 200 years, it was ready. On my last night there, I documented everything. Photographs, measurements, audio recordings, detailed sketches of each symbol. As dawn broke, the air thickened, crackling with an electric charge that made my skin prickle. Standing in the center as sunlight touched the eastern headstones, I watched shadows fall across the formations. Shadows that bent light rather than simply blocking it. Within those shadows, shapes flickered, forms that did not belong to this world. I resigned that morning, effective immediately. My supervisor seemed relieved rather than surprised, mentioning the high turnover for this position. When I asked about previous guards, he was vague, saying only that some found other jobs, others decided this work wasn't for them. Since then, I've tried to return to normal life. I work days now, in a shopping mall where the worst mysteries involve shoplifting teens or lost elderly customers. But sometimes, passing cemeteries or seeing headstones in films, that familiar tightness grips my chest, my breath shortens, and I know something is deeply wrong with the world. Somewhere, other burial grounds are completing their own slow transformations. Other symbols are forming as stones creep with patient, inexorable purpose. I never reported what I found at Willowbrook. Who would believe me? And what if someone did and chose to investigate? Some doors, once opened, can never close. Some knowledge, once released, spreads like infection. The dead don't rest. They are still rearranging themselves. Tonight, across the country, headstones are moving. Symbols are forming. The barriers between worlds grow thinner with every passing hour. I only pray I never have to see what comes through when their work is done. I felt an irrational certainty that something was watching me from the other side of the wall. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and it wasn't just the apartment's usual chill. The heating system wheezed and rattled through the night, but the cold seemed to seep specifically from the eastern wall, as if it were sucking warmth from the room like a hungry mouth. 3 days after moving in, I could no longer ignore the compulsion. I pressed my ear against the wall, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The silence was absolute, thick and suffocating. Then, driven by an impulse I couldn't name, I raised my fist and knocked 3 times against the drywall. The response was immediate and unmistakable. 3 knocks, perfectly timed, coming from the other side. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill. I stepped back, legs suddenly unsteady. My logical mind scrambled for explanations. Pipes settling, the foundation shifting, neighbors, but the knocks were too precise, too perfectly timed to be coincidence. I knocked again, this time in a complex pattern. 2 quick raps, pause, 3 slow ones, pause, 1 final sharp knock. The response came without delay, matching my rhythm exactly. My mouth went dry, my tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth like sandpaper. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind against the windows sent adrenaline shooting through my body. I found myself staring at the wall, imagining it breathing, expanding and contracting like lung tissue. When morning finally arrived, gray light filtering through dirty windows, I was exhausted and trembling. The next evening, I brought home equipment from the office, a stud finder, acoustic detector, even a small thermal imaging camera I'd borrowed under the pretense of a home inspection. My hands shook as I powered up the devices. Professional curiosity warred with a growing sense of dread that felt like ice water in my veins. The stud finder revealed the expected wooden framework, but the acoustic detector picked up something that made my blood run cold. Behind the wall were faint but unmistakable sounds of movement. Footsteps mirroring my own, but offset by what felt like several hours. When I moved from the kitchenette to the bathroom, I heard corresponding footsteps beyond the wall, as if someone had made that journey hours earlier. The thermal imaging revealed the most disturbing evidence yet. A clear heat signature behind the wall, the outline of a living space identical to mine, furniture placement perfectly matching my own. But the heat patterns were old, as if the activity had occurred hours before I was detecting it. My rational mind tried to process this, searching for logical explanations, but my body responded on a more primitive level. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, studied, mimicked. The fine hairs on my arms stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my back. In the days that followed, I documented everything. The sounds behind the wall continued, always seeming to anticipate my movements. When I woke at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom, I'd hear footsteps completing the same journey on the other side, but finishing just as I was beginning. When I made coffee at 7 a.m., the sounds of a morning routine were wrapping up beyond the wall. Sleep became elusive. I lay in bed, every muscle tense, listening to the phantom occupant of the mirror apartment going through my exact bedtime routine hours ahead of schedule. The rustling of sheets, the creak of floorboards, even the specific way I fluffed my pillow, all echoed from behind the wall with a timing that made my skin crawl. The truly terrifying realization came during my second week. I'd been methodically mapping the sounds, trying to understand the pattern, when I noticed something that made my vision blur with panic. The activities behind the wall weren't just similar, they were identical down to the smallest details. The number of steps from bed to bathroom, the duration of running water, even the pattern of my restless pacing during insomnia. But they were happening approximately 4 hours before I performed them. My hands trembled as I wrote this in my notebook, the pen leaving shaky marks on the page. My breathing grew shallow and rapid. The implication was impossible, but the evidence undeniable. Something on the other side of that wall was living my life before I lived it. I began testing this theory with deliberate actions. I would decide to move a chair exactly at 8 p.m., and at 4 p.m. I'd hear the scraping of furniture being moved beyond the wall in the same spot. When I planned to cook dinner at 6:30, the sounds of meal preparation would start at 2:30, following my exact sequence. The sensation of being trapped in some cosmic echo chamber tightened my chest with claustrophobia. My appetite vanished. Food turned to ash in my mouth, and even water tasted bitter. Dark circles, metallic and wrong, carved themselves beneath my eyes as sleep slipped further from reach. Every time I closed them, I could feel it, the presence on the other side of the wall, living my future, stealing my agency. The breaking point came when I heard my own voice. It was muffled, distorted by the barrier, but unmistakably mine. I sat at my small table reviewing architectural plans when I heard myself speaking beyond the wall. The cadence, the inflection, even the pauses for breath. It was perfectly me, but saying words I hadn't yet spoken. My pen slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. For hours later, I found myself speaking those exact words aloud, as if compelled by some invisible script. The realization that I was no longer in control sent a surge of panic crackling through my nerves like electricity. My heart pounded so fiercely I could feel it in my temples, behind my eyes, deep in my throat. I stopped eating regularly. I abandoned every routine. If I could become unpredictable, perhaps I could break the cycle that held me captive. But the sounds from behind the wall continued, now mirroring my erratic behavior, with the same 4-hour delay. My deliberate chaos was pre-lived by my shadow self, making even rebellion feel scripted. The wall stopped feeling like a barrier and became more like a living membrane, permeable and aware. When I pressed my palm against it, the surface felt warm, almost pulsing. The paint rippled beneath my touch, though when I looked directly, everything seemed normal. My vision began to deceive me. Peripheral movements vanished when I turned my head. Shadows fell at impossible angles. Paranoia slithered into my thoughts like poison. I became convinced the building's other tenants watched me. The superintendent knew something he wouldn't say, and the entire structure conspired in whatever was unfolding. When neighbors passed in the hallway, their expressions felt knowing, conspiratorial. Their casual greetings weighed heavy with hidden meaning. My work suffered. Concentration became impossible as every moment was consumed by listening for the sounds behind the wall. Analyzing patterns, documenting the impossible. My boss voiced concern about my appearance and performance, but his words seemed distant, muffled beneath the constant white noise of terror that had settled in my skull. The final revelation came when I realized I could influence the sounds. By planning specific actions with enough detail and intention, I could generate corresponding activity from behind the wall. It was like conducting a symphony of my own future, but the conductor was trapped in the audience, helpless as the music played itself. Late one night, after weeks of mounting horror, I made a decision both desperate and inevitable. I gathered every tool I could find, hammer, crowbar, utility knife, and approached the wall with shaking hands. If there was another apartment, another version of me living my life in advance, I needed to see it. I needed to understand what wore my face, spoke with my voice, and stole my future. As I raised the hammer, ready to tear through the drywall, the sounds from behind the wall ceased completely. The silence was more terrifying than any noise. In that absolute quiet, I heard only my own breathing, my own heartbeat. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. I struck the wall once, hard enough to crack the paint. The impact echoed strangely, as if the space beyond was vast and empty. But as the sound faded, I heard something that made me drop the hammer and stumble backward. The sound of someone dropping a hammer and stumbling backward, at the exact same moment as my strike. Not 4 hours earlier, but simultaneously. The realization crashed over me like ice water in my veins. I had become the echo. I was the one living 4 hours behind, following a script written by whatever version of me existed beyond that wall. The sounds I'd been hearing weren't predicting my future, they were my past, performed by the me who lived before I moved in, before I became trapped in this temporal loop. Standing there, frozen, I understood I was caught in an unbreakable cycle.